So good morning, everybody. Um, First of all, I would like to really thank the IAS organizers for inviting me to speak on this really important topic. I believe this is the first time that transgender issues have made it to the front stage, so to speak. No, thank you. Um, and this is really important that we start talking about bringing HIV prevention to scale for transgender people. I have no conflicts of interest. I think to start on this discussion regarding trans people, I want to set the stage and start from the beginning. So, it's important to think when we're talking about trans people, we should be thinking about the differences between sex and gender. So, what is sex? Sex is biology. It's how we are assigned at birth, and I think in the majority of countries, this is basically anatomy. It's a boy, it's a girl, as we know. And of course, biology, has other components like chromosomes and hormones. We generally don't look at chromosomes unless we have questions. Gender identity, on the other hand, is your sense of who you are as a gendered person, as a man, as a woman, or as both, or as neither. I mean, it's interesting to note that children are very aware of gender differences, usually by the age of about 3, and they understand, themselves as a boy or a girl, and they also can categorize other people. And I think those of you who have children know that if children are confused, they're not shy about coming up to you and saying, like, who are you? So, and also usually by the age of 4, there's a concept of gender constancy or gender stability, that they understand that sex and gender are not something that can change the way you change your clothes. So as we move on talking about trans communities, I want to also say that, language around gender identity has been evolving over time. And it certainly, changes over cultures and over geography. For this presentation, I'm going to be using the definition of trans and transgender and trans people as anyone whose gender identity or expression is different from their sex assigned at birth. But understand also that there, as I said, across the world, there are many people who perhaps fall under the trans umbrella who don't use those terms. And in fact, there are over 60 different terms around the world to describe people of trans experience. So transgender women are those people who are assigned male at birth and currently identify as women or as transgender women. And transgender men are those who are assigned female at birth and now identify as men. There are people who don't fit within this binary, who identify as something in between genders or outside of genders, and there are other terms that we use, for example, non-binary, genderqueer, gender non-conforming, agender. You might have heard gender expansive and gender diverse. So what is it, what do we want to know about trans people? I think the first thing is that many people ask me is, how many trans people are there? And even, I meet clinicians in countries who say, I've never seen a trans person, or there are no trans people in my country. And we know that just can't be true. We believe that there are approximately 25 million transgender adults worldwide. And this estimate is based on the fact that approximately 0.4 to 0.6% of adults are trans. And again, a lot of these data come from North America and Europe. So what do we want to know about trans people? I think the main thing is that wherever you are in the world, whether it's in the United States or in South Africa or in China, there are certain things that many trans people find in common. I think the first thing is that trans people are subject to alarming rates of stigma and discrimination and violence and hate. And also issues such as social exclusion, where it's impossible for them, as you heard before, to get their documents aligned to their gender identity. These are data from the United States, but I wanted to share them with you, that the fact that 35% of trans youth have been bullied in school. Almost half of trans people have faced family rejection. And of course, because of all of this, it's not surprising that 40% of trans people have attempted suicide in their life, and about 10% within the last year. We have alarming rates of people who are living in poverty and who are facing homelessness. And I think probably, most appropriate for this conversation here is the fact that about 1 in 3 transgender people have faced discrimination within healthcare settings, and this is in the United States. And about 1 in 4 have deliberately avoided medical care because of the fear of mistreatment. Now, again, as I said, these data are from the United States, but I'll say that we have seen similar findings any place where the studies have been done. I mean, in this final slide, this background slide shows a website that actually records murders of transgender people around the world. In the United States last year, we had almost 30 transgender women who were murdered, mostly African American and Latina women, and we're actually on a path to exceed that number this year. And why is this important? I think we all understand the impact of stigma, and stigma being, an important social determinant of health and one of the key drivers of HIV risk in transgender populations. So moving on to HIV, and this slide from UNAIDS I think is something that everyone is familiar with. It's showing the latest numbers of people living with HIV around the world. And we can see that there are almost 37 million people. I think we can also see that these data are broken down, as you can see, by gender. So we have information on how many women and how many men are living with HIV. But I think you can see there's something glaringly absent here, and that is, where are the transgender people? I mean, we know that in most countries, for transgender women, often they're just included under the statistics for cisgender MSM. And for transgender men and for non-binary individuals, they're often not even considered at all. And I think we have to do far better at recording the existence of trans people living with HIV. So I'm going to quote someone I greatly admire, who is Laverne Cox. And she had very wise words when she said, what message are we sending to young people who are trans and gender nonconforming when we don't even count them? We suggest that their identities don't even matter. And I would say that this is the situation that we face with most health issues that impact trans and gender diverse people. We're just not counting anybody. In 2013, Dr. Steph Burrell and colleagues, published a paper looking at the global burden of HIV in transgender women. And I think, this was really a wake-up call for all of us who work in this area. First of all, they found that many countries didn't have any data whatsoever on trans individuals. But in the 15 countries that did provide data, they found that on average, about 1 in 5 transgender women was living with HIV. And in fact, for a transgender woman, their odds of being HIV positive was about 40 times greater than the general population. And as I said, this was really a wake-up call, and also, I think, a push for countries to start thinking about disaggregating their data so that we could actually see, what was happening with this population. So, of course, since then, and I'm not going to put the data up here, but since then, there have been a number of studies, published in places like Lebanon and Iran, Cambodia, Malawi, but all showing the same health disparity, the same disparities in HIV risk for transgender women. And, what do we know about the global burden of HIV for transgender men? There are not a lot of data about this. The quantitative data, as you can see, are very limited. There are very few studies that have looked at this. The studies that have been done are very small. What we know is that the prevalence of HIV seems to be much lower, so anywhere from 0 to 4% when it's lab confirmed, and anywhere from 0 to 10%. Again, small studies, and sometimes only 1 or 2 people being living with HIV, but by self-report it's a little bit higher. But I think it's important also to consider, who we're thinking about when we're talking about transgender men. Not all transgender men are at risk, so we're really thinking about transgender men who are having sex with cisgender men. And again, in many countries, these data are not even being counted. And I don't have a slide for non-binary people because we don't really have data about that. So, thinking forward about PrEP, the World Health Organization suggests that we should be considering PrEP for any population where the HIV incidence exceeds about 3%. And the IAS USA is using a figure of about 2%. And I think if you look at the HIV incidence of transgender women globally, you can see that we meet that threshold and far exceed that threshold in many countries. And I think it underscores the importance of ensuring that PrEP is available for trans people and making sure that the countries that are now considering implementing HIV PrEP programs are including transgender people, and especially transgender women in those programs, which actually isn't happening at the moment. So I wanted to move forward to a slide on PrEP. And I think that, again, many of you are probably very familiar with this slide. That's basically showing results from the PrEP efficacy trials that occurred and led to the approval of oral PrEP. I mean, the first thing, of course, is PrEP works. But the second was that the efficacy of PrEP was directly related to adherence. I think the second thing, which may not have occurred to some of you, was that at the time that PrEP was approved, the oral PrEP was approved, that very few studies had included transgender people in any meaningful way. And really only IPREX had included transgender women. And I think we learned a lot from this. We learned a lot from not including transgender women in a purposeful way. Some important lessons. The first publications that came out about IPREX, because I read the first publication and I thought, this is interesting. There were only 29 transgender women making up 1% of participants. I don't know what I'm going to do with this. But then, a few years later, Dr. Maddie Deutsch, who's from UCSF, took a deeper dive into the demographics of participants in IPREX. And the first thing that she found was that it was beyond the 29 people. In fact, that 296 people had identified as trans or travesti. There were 29 who identified as women, and 14 who identified as men but were using feminizing hormones. So that was now 14%. So enough that we could actually start to see subgroup analyses being done. And I think the results were sobering. Whereas within cisgender men, we saw high rates of efficacy. Among transgender women, it appeared that the PrEP perhaps wasn't working. There was a hazards ratio of 1. Of course, when they looked deeper again into the data, they found that possibly one of the reasons for this was that there was an extremely low adherence to oral PrEP, much lower than among cisgender men. Also, that for transgender women who seroconverted, there was complete lack of study drug in their blood. And furthermore, that for transgender women who had blood levels consistent with 4 or more pills per week, that there were no seroconversions. So clearly, PrEP was working, but it was only working in the women who were taking it. The other thing that was found, and I think this raised a lot of questions, was that for transgender women who were using hormones, the study drug in their system was lower than for transgender women who weren't using hormones. And of course, one of the questions was, is this an adherence issue or is this a drug-drug interaction issue? Since this subgroup analysis was done, there have been several other studies that have been published, they're pharmacokinetic studies, trying to address the question about whether or not these drug-drug interactions exist. And I'm not going to go through them in detail, but I wanted to summarize the major points. And the first part was that I think the most important for trans communities is that estrogen levels do not change with oral PrEP. And that's really what people wanted to hear. The second is that, yes, we do think the serum tenofovir levels are reduced in the presence of estrogens. It seems to be anywhere from 13 to maybe 20% in the studies, but we're not really sure about the clinical significance of that. because again, we do know that PrEP works when taken. But I think what we're thinking is that transgender women on hormones may need greater adherence to oral PrEP. And I think these are the main takeaways from the studies that have been done so far. I think there's more to think about as we're moving forward with, what's next in the pipeline and what's next to come up. Thinking to the future and other biomedical interventions, there's been a lot of interest in vaginal microbicides that using tenofovir. I think we're all aware of the Caprisa 004 tenofovir gel study that showed that although there was high efficacy, there was reduced efficacy of tenofovir gel in people who had vaginal dysbiosis and who had a preponderance of Gardnerella and anaerobic bacteria compared to those who had a predominance of lactobacilli. Now, transgender men often use testosterone to change their appearance, to deepen their voice, to have facial hair. In some studies, upwards of 80% of transgender men in the United States have used testosterone. It does have some untoward effects, including the fact that you can develop vaginal atrophy, and we're now starting to understand that it can have changes in the vaginal microbiome. In this study that was from McPherson and colleagues, transgender men on testosterone were less likely to have lactobacillus as their primary genus compared to cisgender women, and more likely to have other bacteria, increased microbial diversity, and higher amounts of bacteria such as Gardnerella and other bacteria that are associated with bacterial vaginosis. And I want to know, what does this mean for transgender men who may be thinking in the future of using these agents? And I think it really underscores the issues that can happen when we don't include transgender people in a meaningful way in our research studies. There's also been a lot of excitement about long-acting injectable medications, such as cabotegravir. And again, the studies haven't really included transgender people in a purposeful way. I work in a clinic where, we've been very excited about long-acting injectables because many of the people we see, especially our youth, have difficulty with, sometimes with oral PrEP. There are barriers to oral PrEP and adherence. So we're thinking, whoa, this might be something really exciting. But we also, I work in a clinic with over 4,000 transgender people. And the transgender women I see, anywhere from 50 to 60, sometimes 70%, have injected silicone and soft tissue fillers into their breasts, into their buttocks, and into their thighs. So what does this mean for the feasibility and efficacy of long-acting injectables? And again, I think we need to consider this and consider how we're going to roll this out in trans populations. So I want to talk a little bit about the PrEP care continuum. The PrEP care continuum is not as well defined as the HIV care continuum, but I think there are some necessary steps. For example, assessing someone's eligibility for PrEP, linking them to PrEP services, initiating PrEP, and when someone is on PrEP, finding a way to assess retention and adherence on PrEP. We don't have a lot of data in trans populations on the PrEP care continuum. So I'm going to take data from two studies. The first is the LIGHT study, which is the leading innovation for transgender women's health and empowerment. And I know we have many of the co-investigators, at least one of the PIs in the audience. So the LIGHT study is plans to enroll 1,100 women who are HIV negative across 6 districts in the eastern and southern United States. We're a study site. Women come in every 3 months for study visits. They receive HIV testing either at home or in the clinic, and then STI testing every 12 months. What we've seen among the transgender women is that many have indications for PrEP, whether it's that their sexual partners are living with HIV, they're engaging in sex work, they have condomless receptive anal sex. In fact, about 40% of the transgender women in the study have a PrEP indication, and it's about the same for youth up to 24 and for those over 24. The other thing that we see is that there's a high awareness of PrEP, but when you start looking at the number that have ever taken PrEP, it's less than a quarter, and around only 12 to 13% have taken PrEP in the last 30 days, and only around 9%, so less than 10% are adherent to PrEP. And I think when we know about the recent data from CROI, where we see that levels of PrEP penetration into the MSM community are around 40% now, I mean, these numbers are extremely low. We also have recently published from Sarit Golub and Gus Klein, PrEP Continuum for Transgender Men. And this was an online study that engaged over 1,800 transmasculine individuals. And they found that almost a quarter of the sample met one or more criteria for PrEP. And here again, we can see with the PrEP continuum of care that, about 82% access health care, 65% had had an HIV test in the last year, only 34% received PrEP info from a provider, and we only have 11% on PrEP. Again, far lower than the 40% that we're seeing among cisgender MSM. And this is something I think we should all be concerned about. So what are the reasons why trans people are not on PrEP, right? Why is this? And, I don't think we need to look very far, because trans people are telling us why they're not on PrEP and the things that we need to do to facilitate PrEP uptake. So this is kind of condensing all the messages from many qualitative studies that have been done. And the main barriers to PrEP are, the fact that for a transgender woman going into the clinic and being handed information that's meant for, cisgender MSM is a huge barrier. Mistrust of providers, being worried about side effects, being worried that the hormones are going to somehow, be less effective when people are on PrEP. HIV stigma, that affects everybody. Lack of trans-inclusive marketing, consent issues for minors. And I mean, these are all things, again, that we can address. Facilitators, we're being told by trans communities that we need trans-inclusive and gender-affirming sexual health services, trans-competent providers and materials and health promotion that include pictures of those of us who are members of the trans community. If you're getting PrEP from a clinic, wonderful if you're getting hormones from that clinic as well. And obviously active provider engagement and assistance around PrEP, because it can be really hard to navigate those systems. And lastly, community mobilization. I think gender-affirming spaces is something that's really important, and you'll hear a lot more about at this conference. So I'm going to highlight a few clinics: the Tangerine Clinic, the Condesa Clinic, which is here in Mexico City, Callan Lloyd in New York, and Fenway Clinic, the Clinic Q, which is in London. They all understand what it takes to bring trans people into care. The first thing is make sure that your intake forms allow people to say who they are, that they're inclusive of multiple gender identities. Ask people what their pronouns are and their names, and use them consistently. Providers need to be knowledgeable about trans people, and they need to be able to assess psychosocial and mental health needs. I mean, having images is really powerful, and I'll show you some pictures. Images on educational materials, brochures, and websites. And most important of all, having trans-identified staff as leaders in your clinic, as providers in your clinic, as patient navigators. These are all things that can bring people into care. So again, thinking about what happens when someone first comes into the office, and what that experience is like, and are they going to be able to write their name down? And this is one example of the two-step question, which has been validated and found to be highly effective in identifying trans people. So you say who you are, whether you're a man, a woman, a transgender man, a transgender woman. And again, trans people can identify, a trans man can identify as a man or a trans man or as something else. And then your sex assigned at birth. And this allows you to identify who is transgender. It's really important that this is validated in different communities, and the terms are changed to reflect the terms that are used within a given environment. I just want to highlight one other thing. The entry point to PrEP is HIV screening, and we understand that for many trans people, there's a lot of fear sometimes about HIV screening. This is a study that was done from the Behavioral Risk Factor Surveillance System in the United States, showing that transgender women and transgender men screen for HIV at about half the rate of cisgender MSM, despite transgender women having the highest HIV incidence. So what can you do? Powerful images of trans people, getting tested, promoting things like the National Transgender HIV Testing Day. These are all very important. Another entry point to PrEP is sexual health services, and I love this campaign from the New York City Health Department, this Bear It All. Tell your provider about sexual health. And as you can see, these are pictures of transgender people, and what a powerful image to have a transgender man with his shirt off and saying, I'm proud, I'm a transgender man, and I'm going to talk about my sexual health with my provider. Scaling up PrEP, making sure that you have the images and the information that trans people need. We developed a brochure, and the first thing on there is, PrEP will not interfere with your hormones, and really that's being proactive and addressing those issues. Just moving forward, and I think I'm ending up, but there are some important projects underway. It's imperative that we do studies in trans communities, and we have 3 demonstration projects in the United States addressing trans communities. The Triumph Project, Stay Study, and Impact. We also have, at our center, a clinical observation study called Fired Up, which is looking at promoters of PrEP among transgender women, and also has a sub-study looking at hormones and interactions with oral PrEP. We have HIV testing, Project Moxie, which is looking at home testing with or without an intervention, I think, among youth. And then HPTN 091. So these are all things that you can look forward to in the future. So I think final take-home messages. The final things that I really wanted to say here are that, we know that trans people experience a disproportionate risk for HIV acquisition. Transgender women as well as trans men, and we don't know about non-binary people. We need to be including them. Challenges exist with rolling out PrEP for trans communities, especially when this isn't done in a purposeful way. And we still need better data collection of trans people and more and meaningful inclusion in research. And we also need to remember that to be successful in HIV prevention for trans people, we have to think beyond PrEP and consider how we can address all of the social and structural issues that increase HIV risk and also impact PrEP access and uptake. So I want to lastly thank you all for sitting through this last talk of the morning with me. I know it's been a long morning, but I wanted to also thank all the people that I work with, study collaborators, and obviously the many people who looked at my slides and offered suggestions. Special shout out to all the Callan people in the audience. Hey. and also Ali Harris. So thank you very much.